This is it. The World Was Ours. Jewish Legacy of Vilna. And while I do have my criticisms of this documentary, and I will make my criticism known, it is a very well made, beautiful, beautiful documentary. And it'll widen the context of what exactly had been lost. And I think it was filmed after. I mean, the document was created after the war, obviously. It contains archive footage. I think watching this will give you a deeper understanding of the City of Bones itself. I think those materials feed into each other, and I think we should watch it together. And I will give my thoughts as we watch it together. I also recommend all of you to go and let me see, subscribe to this channel. It is actually growing pretty rapidly, which I'm happy about. No, Warsaw is not commonly referred to as the City of Bones. There are a plethora of reasons for that. Okay. Which I might actually explain in the future as well. Let us begin watching. And I liked your live stream with Dylan Burns. Oh! MCA DHD. So you came here from Dylan's audience, yes? My big goal for the nearest future is to have a second talk with Dylan. That is my goal, basically, to secure some sort of second talk with Dylan. But unfortunately, it is easier said than done. I will get it. You can be part of that effort by telling Dylan to talk to me. Okay. With that said, I'll donate to Dylan tomorrow. Thank you, fake Alec Kyle Parker. We are doing our best. Keffels actually wrote me that for now she's a bit busy, but we got a message from Keffels, so that's a nice sign. I want to see you with Vosh, Destiny, and Stardust one day. You mean talking to them or size-wise? I did some tours in Savannah, Georgia, and they said apparently like 1/3 of the city had unmarked or unknown graves underneath it from tuberculosis, death, and other diseases. People often couldn't afford burials, I guess. Interesting. It might be worth looking into, actually. Lots of history there in the roads, buildings. Yeah, exactly. I think it might be very well worth looking into and talking about. Yes, talking to them and size-wise. Okay, yeah, that might be interesting. But first, let us watch this. A very nice documentary. And as I said, it will make The City of Bones, which will premiere soon, make a lot more sense to you. When the Germans seized my city, Vilna, about 80,000 Jews lived there. How many remained after German occupation? After the occupation, 600 Jewish people remained in Vilna. The 79,400 were exterminated. Yes. To keep things in perspective, in Warsaw, you had over 400,000 Jewish people living in Warsaw. Okay? And most of them died. The Polish Blair White, that would be a pretty, that would be a discussion. The Polish Jewish community had, give or take, 3.5 million people in it. And give or take a bit over 300,000 people survived out of the 3.5 million community in Poland. Hi, Lucy. Hello, Dexmex.
Do I consider myself Russian, Lithuanian, or Polish? I think it's much simpler to say I'm a Jew from Vilna, because that actually says it. This amazing community, not being numerous, were able to give a very big contribution to Jewish thought, Jewish life, Jewish philosophy through the ages.
It is vanished. There is no more of the Jewish life in Vilna, as if...
Vilna is the Polish pronunciation. It's the Polish way of saying Vilnius or Vilna. And you will hear this Polish pronunciation throughout the documentary.
The earth had opened and everything fell in.
As a child, I was aware of this world which was very, very alive. I always remember these people like that, being not some monuments of stone, but real flesh and blood.
Correct. You tap it like that as well,
it's
yeah.
so important for the world to know.
MCADHD. Maybe I've asked you that before. I tend to ask people the same thing many times. Are you from Poland, perhaps?
How we live. That's why talking about the good times makes the bad times even more impossible to accept.
That's true. I still find the whole thing impossible to accept, which is why I dream of a project that I will want to put into. I will want to start a. I will want to start a project pretty soon. Yes, I am, and I've returned to the country. Oh, interesting. Nice. I think a lot of people don't seem to understand the gravity of even 1,000 deaths, let alone these numbers. It's hard to picture thousands of bodies just covering the streets of a town in bodies. You could stack them high. Or hundreds of thousands of people killed. Also, for further context, after World War I, the demographic breakdown of Vilnius or Vilna was 50% Polish people, 40% Jewish people, and the remaining 10% were Lithuanian people. There were some even German people, I think, some Russian people, but 50% were Polish people and 40% were Jewish people.
I thought that Vilna was the capital of the world. I know that Vilna was the capital of my world.
When I walked through the streets of Vilna, I could hear somebody was studying the Talmud, somebody was playing the violin, somebody was reciting, somebody was singing.
We had an opera ensemble which staged operas.
It was a bit complicated. This gets very complicated, okay? Because, okay, it's a bit of a tangent, but I think it's important to say. So, before World War I, there was no Poland, there was no Lithuania, there was no Ukraine, and there was no Belarus as well. And before that, you had the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a union between the Kingdom of Poland and the Great Duchy of Lithuania. And there are a couple of grave errors that are made when discussing the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Error number 1. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not Poland, okay? It was a composite state that actually comprised of many ethnicities, many cultures, many languages, many religions as well. Mistake number 2. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not a nation state. National identity as we know it today did not exist in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Nationalities did not exist in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as we understand them today. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was also called the Commonwealth of the Two Nations, but the world nations, Naród, Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, meant something very different then than it means now. What it meant was a nation, a political nation, was basically the people that lived in the territory of a given kingdom, duchy, etc. Okay? And that brings me to point 3, which is not a mistake, but it has to be explained. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth formed in 15... I'm going to have to look up the exact date. The Union of Lublin was in 1569. And before that, you had the Kingdom of Poland and the Great Duchy of Lithuania. Okay? It had an elected king. But I will explain it in point 3. The Commonwealth had an estate system, or as I would translate it further into English, a class system. At the top of the system were the nobles, the nobility, who were the de facto citizens, and from the nobility, a king was elected. You had classes like the peasants, who were basically the lowest class in this hierarchy. Jewish people were actually their own class within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and enjoyed the so-called Golden Age. And so on and so forth. Okay? Now, after the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, national identity. Arkael, we played your game today. We have played your game today. Pseudo regalia. We've played your game today. So after the Jewish people had a special relationship with the nobility. So yes, there was respect there. It's the topic of Jewish people within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Kingdom of Poland itself deserves its own big dedicated topic segment. Nationalities started forming. Polish national identity started forming, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, etc. Okay? And while, yes, Vilnius was a capital of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was also combined into a single entity. Okay? So yes. So, for example, it ended with people of different ethnicities living amongst one another, and it led to situations like Vilnius being majority Polish, Lviv being majority Polish, and with Lviv, listen, I push hard against calling the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Poland because it's incorrect. Okay? It is incorrect to call the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Poland. It is a view that is retrospectively projected onto the Commonwealth from the perspective of the Polish nation state, which is very incorrect. So the newly formed nations started fighting over which territories of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth should belong to the newly formed nation state. And for example, you had Lviv, which was majority Polish, but you had all the surrounding areas which were majority Ukrainian. Okay? And it led to the Polish-Ukrainian War in 1918, which ended with Poland winning and Lviv and all the Ukrainian areas becoming part of Poland, the newly formed nation state of Poland. Does that make sense? Similar things happened with Vilna, Vilnius, which is majority Polish. So it, through various machinations, ended up in the newly formed nation state of Poland. Right? But once again, I have to stress, nation state of Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, very different concepts. Very, very different concepts. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a composite state. Pre-World War II Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, are were nation states. And a composite state is something very different from a nation state. So semi-borderless, and each class or demographic acted like a state within the U.S. They each had their own collective voice for the grander Commonwealth. That's not exactly how that worked. That's not exactly how that worked. The Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania remained sort of as separate bodies, as autonomous bodies, but they were united as one Commonwealth. And of course, there's the fact that if Ruthenian, because you also had Ruthenia, which became Belarus and Ukraine, if the Ruthenian nobles had pushed for their rights more during the Pact of Lublin, then there was a pretty big chance for a Polish, Lithuanian, Ruthenian Commonwealth from the get-go. In the year of the Pact of Lublin. Does that make sense? My city has a large Ukrainian population. They do cultural festivals each year, and you can get free meatballs, cholopci and pierogi. Nice. That does sound nice. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Wait, how close or different is it to say ancient Greece? And it's different. It's very different. Because it was one big country. There was a union of Kingdom of Poland and the Great Duchy of Lithuania. They were in a union. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? RKL? Does that make sense? Greater Rand? Fake Alec Kyle Parker? Does that make sense? MCADHD? If anything doesn't make sense, then ask and I will address the topic. But let's return to the Vilna community of pre-World War II Poland.
In Yiddish, Aida.
Oh, one last thing. The biggest example of how fluid the notion of nationality, national identity, and how fluid the notion of nation states was when it was still forming is how a famous Polish piece of literature called Pan Tadeusz starts with the words, "O Lithuania, my homeland, you are as health itself." Lithuania. Right? Because people still thought in the terms of the wider Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even when the national identity started already forming then. Okay, let's continue.
Carmen and other operas in Yiddish.
Yiddish.
It was amazing.
Being a Jewish teenager, it was just nourishing.
It was such a privilege. It was such an extraordinary thing to be from Vilna that in your family, everybody was telling you, you are the aristocracy of the Jewish people. You are from Vilna.
Okay, this is where I have to push back a bit. Because this notion of the aristocracy from Vilna that all the things that they're speaking about with Yiddish, with the culture, it was also present in Warsaw. Because, as I've said before the war started, 50,000 Jewish people lived in Vilna, and 350,000 Jewish people lived in Warsaw. You know? Like, I know that the documentary is going to build up Vilna as really a big deal, but at the end of the day, when it came to the Polish Jewish community, Warsaw was its center by sheer size alone.
Vilna was a city of ideas, of dreams. It was a city of deep, profound meditation. Vilna lived with history, old families, old tradition, old memories, and at the same time, it was a city with a tremendous desire to strive for something new, for something unusual, for something behind the mountains.
I believe, gosh, by some estimates, Jewish people made up 1/3 of the population of the capital of Poland, and by some estimation, Jewish people were also almost like 50% of pre-World War II Warsaw. It depends on which estimates you look at. You know?
According to legend, Vilna was born in a dream, a vision that came to Gediminas, the 14th century ruler of Lithuania. One night on a hunting expedition, he dreamt of a large wolf with an iron shield, howling fiercely at the moon. His high priestess said the wolf represented a great fortress city that would rise on those very hunting grounds, and the animal's cry forecast the fame that city would someday achieve. And so it was that by 1322, Vilna became the capital of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a vast territory that bordered both Russia and Poland. As the great empires of Eastern Europe expanded and contracted over the centuries that followed, Vilna changed hands many times, a child of all and a child of none.
There are many ways of calling the city. My mother's family called it Vilna. I call it Vilno in Polish. The Lithuanians call it Vilnius, and who knows what the Russians call it.
Vilna was a fascinating city of many languages and denominations. There was no one Vilna. Everyone belonged to a different Vilna.
It was an explosion of sounds on a weekday where you would hear Yiddish, Polish, Russian, and even sometimes Belarusian, sometimes Lithuanian. Peasants would come from the surrounding countryside to sell mountains of cheese and butter and vegetables and flowers. And in those streets, you would have Russians buying, Jews buying, Poles selling, Belarusians arriving, cultures intermingled, united by mutual need, sometimes by mutual respect, though alas, one has to say, very frequently by hostility as well.
Depending in what circle you moved, you had a different perspective.
Right.
People belonging to the Polish-speaking Vilna had very little knowledge what was going on in the Jewish Vilna, and vice versa.
The Jews were part of Vilna since the 1300s. By the 15th century, they were granted full rights and privileges. But over the years, here as elsewhere, they were persecuted by less tolerant regimes. Despite anti-Semitism, they managed to forge a city within a city, a hub of Jewish life and learning that made Vilna the spiritual and cultural center of European Jewry.
That's not entirely true. As I've said, Warsaw also forged a city within a city. In fact, many Jewish people who came from different parts of the then Russian Empire said that of all the cities, Warsaw was the most Jewish. So I guess opinions on such things will differ. But it does also speak to how big and how thriving the Jewish community in Poland was.
So much Vilna the spiritual city within a city, a hub of Jewish life and learning that made Vilna the spiritual and cultural center of European Jewry.
The center. The person said a hub, but the center, which is not exactly correct.
So much so that it is said that when Napoleon passed through Vilna, he called it the Jerusalem of Lithuania.
Vilna was a meeting point for ideas and a meeting point for Jewish history and Jewish change. It always held learning in the highest regard. If you look for what holds the Jewish people together over the centuries, the answer is learning. Learning. This is the core.
That intellectual fervor was rooted in a rich tradition of religious scholarship. This was embodied by Vilna's great synagogue. Its courtyard formed the heart of the Jewish quarter. This vibrant courtyard housed the famous
Well, of course, the Pale of settlement in Russia was preventing any bigger Russian city from being too Jewish, quote unquote. Right.
Rashun Library, which had one of the largest collections of Judaica in all of Eastern Europe.
Hey Lucy, prepare to suffer tomorrow. Remember those VFX guys who used AI to make an anime short? I remember, yes. Religious centers do be done pretty. Okay, there's I do have to explain. A synagogue is nothing like a Catholic church or any other Christian church. Okay? This is a thing that I have to explain. Guess what I'm asking you to cover tomorrow? I don't know. A synagogue is not a temple. That is very important. That is a very important thing to say, okay? There's a crucial difference between a Christian or Catholic or a Catholic or any other Christian church and a synagogue. A synagogue is not a temple. A mosque. Right? A mosque. Yeah. So yes. Keep that in mind. A synagogue is not a temple. It is a place of prayer, yes, but is also a place of learning, a place, it's very much serves of like a community center for Jewish life.
In the 18th century, Vilna epitomized the Jewish soul, known throughout the world for the brilliance of its Talmudic scholars. The most famous of those, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Solomon Zalman, was so revered that he earned the title of Gaon, or genius. In a bold gesture, the Gaon opposed an ancient ban on secular learning and encouraged Jews to study the sciences, mathematics, even music.
Jewish Lithuania was much more open to modernity. That symbol of the Vilna Gaon reminded them that they were living in a special city where responsibility combined with determination to create
Oh, I'm gonna be biased, but yes.
something new.
And there was a feeling that we are not just a religion, but a nation. And that feeling was exploited by the new movements that were secular in their essence.
Vilna became the birthplace of the pioneering socialist movement called the Bund.
The Bund was a Jewish socialist movement that said to the Jews, we can change our lives and fight for liberation here in Eastern Europe and become dignified citizens here in the cities.
Keep in mind, Jewish socialists were a counter movement to the Zionist movement. Historical name, what do you mean?
Where we live.
World War I marked a sea change for the Jews of Vilna.
Giegler. Giegler is my historical name.
At war's end, after 100 years of Russian rule, Vilna found itself once again in the midst of a power struggle. Finally, Poland prevailed.
The Poles took Vilna in April 1919, and on April 19th, 1919, the day that they entered the city, there was a terrible pogrom. Many Jews were killed. Hundreds were wounded. April 19th was the symbol of bloodshed and murder.
It would take a new Polish leader, a native of Vilna, Joseph Pilsudski, to put an end to the suppressive tide of anti-Semitism in 1919. He helped launch a 20-year renaissance of Jewish life in Vilna, which rivaled the accomplishments of more storied urban centers, like Berlin or Warsaw.
We might do a stream about Józef Piłsudski in the future.
General Pilsudski tried to create a really strong and great Poland. He tried to accommodate and bring in as many of the minorities as possible. Maybe pro forma, but he was against excesses against Jews. He was. Because it didn't fit the image of Poland, which he envisioned and which he would like to project for the entire world.
Pilsudski issued a proclamation. I am not instituting a military government, but a civilian one, led by the people of the country. He vowed, everyone will be protected, regardless of belief or nationality. That edict granted Jews the freedom to participate as equals, and they seized the opportunity. When the university reopened, after being shut down for 60 years by the Russians, Jews comprised a quarter of the student body. No longer relegated as second-class citizens, the Jews of Vilna passionately pursued both culture and causes and were deeply committed to their social obligations.
My father and my mother wanted very much to work with children to elevate their level of education and Jewish consciousness.
And of course, there's the glue that connected it all together and will be mentioned here, Yiddish, which, as you may know now, Yiddish now is a language that is faced with extinction. Yiddish as a language is on the brink of extinction right now.
Participation in Jewish life. Their ideals were not so much religious, but more civic and social.
They focus their efforts on the ancient Jewish quarter, where close to 15% of Vilna's
Of which it doesn't mean anything. It's just a thing that, yeah.
Jews lived. It was a dense, congested area, now home to a poor population, further swelled by a flood of refugees in the wake of World War I.
The Jewish quarter was 6 or 7 blocks large, and it housed 10,000 people. So the Jewish quarter was not isolated. It was in the center of the city. Anybody walking through the city passed the Jewish quarter.
I remember that quarter vividly because I passed it every day of my life until probably age 14. Coming from where we lived, the streets were very wide, with comfortable homes, with alleys of chestnut trees. The moment you enter the Jewish quarter, not a single tree, not a single bit of green. And the streets, instead of being wide and sunny, turn into crooked, narrow, winding little places, which from time to time, after every block, are interrupted by shops. So you have there a profusion of smells, colors, motion, crowds.
You saw a lot of poor people there, badly dressed, children in rags. Of course, I felt very bad for them because I saw the difference, how I lived and how they live.
There were many Jewish doctors who not only they were doctors, they were philanthropists who understood the disparity between the rich Jews of Vilna and the poor.
The importance of
By
the
the year
community.
1920, the prominent physician, Dr. Sema Shabbat, had spearheaded the Vilna branch of TAZ, the Society to Protect the Health of the Jewish population.
Das verhiebt uns gesund von der jüdischen Bevölkerung in Polen. Kranke werden geheilt. Aufgehendige jüdische Lebens werden beschützt.
In Warsaw, you had several Jewish hospitals.
Within a year, there were TAZ medical facilities not just in Vilna, but in 40 small towns throughout the region. Besides treating the sick, they led a campaign to improve nutrition and to provide free medicine for thousands of children. That spirit of giving went far beyond medicine. Every trade group, from butchers to carpenters to teachers to religious organizations, sponsored some kind of charity. They
Once
were
again, like the importance of the community, of people supporting one another, of, mutual support.
Vocational courses, free loan societies, free lending libraries, and child care centers, all administered by the Jewish community.
The community organized a special institution for juvenile delinquent boys. They didn't end up in jail. They worked there. They were taught there. They had a tremendous garden. The director of this is
Another important aspect of the community, the rehabilitation. Yiddish is a very German-sounding language. I learned a little to all my German teachers back in the days. That is because Yiddish is a language that was based on an old dialect of German combined with elements of Hebrew. Sorry? What do you mean, what is that image?
Institution. He introduced me to the little thieves, and I looked at them, and they looked very charming. And I said, "Are you sure they're thieves? They look so nice, and they're so polite." After spending 20 minutes, my watch was gone, my money was gone. The director said I told him to do it because they are very, very competent little thieves. That was Vilna. They embraced these little thieves, cared for them, and the little thieves were aware that they are not excluded from the society, that there's a way out.
Rehabilitation.
All of this assistance was not only virtuous, but essential, because even in Pilsudski's Poland, anti-Semitism could not be extinguished.
I heard about anti-Semitism in my home all the time. Anti-Semitism followed my father throughout his career because his friends who graduated the officer school together with him were majors and colonels, and some were generals, and he was still a lieutenant.
Even in the university which Pilsudski had reopened, Jews could not escape discrimination.
I came to the university in 1932. There were white Russians and Lithuanians and Ukrainians and some Germans, but Jews were singled out in the general association of students of the University of Vilna. The only students who couldn't belong were Jews.
By and large, however, Pilsudski's reforms did improve life. Yiddish schools, which had been forbidden under Tsarist regimes, now became partially funded by the Polish government.
The Yiddish language was the main language of Jewish people in the region. And as I said before, now it is on the brink of being extinct. Antisemitism spawned from the story of Jesus' crucifixion. It's more complicated than that.
Die Kinder wissen, wem sind die dosige Wörter?
Yiddish, the language common to Jews throughout Eastern Europe, a language that was considered unsophisticated and associated with poverty, now acquired a patina of culture and class.
When this folk language begins to nurture a modern educational system, this is revolutionary. Instead of living in the past, you're now saying, I can reshape my life here and now, in the present. And my language is not just something that I happen to use, but my language will become the tool that I will use to change who I am.
In the Vilna community, Yiddish was a language of the people. It united the poor, the middle class, the traders, the intelligentsia, and the professionals.
There's a very interesting, complicated aspect when it comes to the creation of a wider Polish Yiddish press, because there was a group of Jewish people called the Litvaks that came from more eastern regions, and they basically established the wider press. And because the intelligentsia, to a large degree, spoke and communicated in languages like Russian, Polish, and Yiddish was this unifier that did not treat people of certain economical standing as worse. Everybody was equal when it came to Yiddish, the language of everybody. How I hate Dmowski for being a jealous loser and sabotaging almost every Piłsudski plan, and also for being a bitter jealous loser. Well, Dmowski was a bigot and a nationalist, and we will discuss Dmowski on a stream in the future for sure as well. That's right. It's interesting how a way of speech becomes the incorrect low-class speech. Language always is changing. African American vernacular is considered really broken, especially in school, but it communicates information perfectly fine. That's the job of a language. Yes, and Yiddish is its own language, and it's a beautiful language at that.
Yiddish was a language of the Jews of Vilna, and they were extraordinarily proud of it.
This great transformation took place all over Eastern Europe, but Vilna became the capital of this new imaginary universe called Yiddishland, the land of Yiddish.
Sort of, but not exactly. The idea of Yiddishland is that it has no capital. There is no land of the Yiddish land, ironically enough. The idea of Yiddishland is that people are scattered around the world, but they are unified by this language, Yiddish.
In den Beis hamigdosh in a winkel heider.
The music I associate with Vilna is my mother's lullabies. I almost liked being sick because when I was sick, my mother would put a big pillow on her lap and put me on the pillow and hug me with the pillow and sing to me. And I hear it now.
Steht a Klor weiß Zigale, das Zigale is gefahren handeln, das wird sein dein.
By the mid-1920s, there was a thriving Yiddish educational system that extended from primary schools through higher learning.
Shlov sheida leshlov.
Vilna, because it was between the empires and not belonging to any of them, it was neither Russian, nor German, nor Polish, nor Lithuanian, and all of them at the same time, it could preserve its own culture in Yiddish.
Vilna's flourishing Jewish community was
That's also not entirely correct. Like the Warsaw Jewish community was huge, very thriving, very diverse.
Influential that when a group of international scholars, among them the historian Simon Dubnov, decided to form an academy dedicated to Yiddish language and culture, there was no question where it would be located. As one attending scholar put it, in Vilna, they take the matter very seriously. Vilna idealists are great pragmatists, and they have shown how to make dreams come true. International luminaries such as Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud lent their names in support of the endeavor. It was called the Yiddish Scientific Institute, the academy known as YIVO,
important,
and was headed by Max Weinreich,
very important
a linguistic
institute.
scholar and journalist from Vilna.
Very important.
To assemble YIVO's library, Weinreich asked Yiddish publishers all over the world to donate one copy of each book in their catalog, and he encouraged volunteers, known as Sammlers or collectors, to gather all kinds of Jewish ethnographic material.
Interesting.
You had in Poland alone 150 registered circles of collectors in different towns and cities sending material to YIVO. And not only great historical documents, but materials about everyday life.
We would go to the fish market, and there were women selling fish, and we would make them angry. And I remember as today that a fat big woman with a wet towel would run after me and hit me with the towel and curse me. And that's all we wanted. We would then go home and write down the curses, right? For example, ich will machen von deiner Kischkes a Telefon. I will make a telephone of your guts. Okay? Or I will turn your intestines into a telephone, meaning telephone line, of course.
There was no Library of Congress for Yiddish. YIVO became the bibliographic center for Yiddish studies. It became the leading center for research on Jewish culture, most of which expressed itself in the Yiddish language. What all of these amounted to was the expression of a need.
I think it goes without saying what it means for all this that Yiddish now faces extinction as a language, right? What it means for all of that culture, all of that knowledge, all of that writing, all of that literature, right?
To make clear to ourselves who exactly we are. It was intended to deal with the problems of the Jews in Europe, the problems of joining a modern society, the problems of facing anti-Semitism, the problems of living with a variety of ethnic groups, with a variety of nationalities in the same place at the same time. The question is, how do Jews become part of European society, nevertheless remain Jews?
Throughout the 1920s and 30s, that question fueled an extraordinary outpouring of creative expression among Vilna's Jews. Debates raged among communists, Bundists, and Zionists, Orthodox Jews and atheists, Hebrewists and Yiddishists. Even middle-class women joined in, trading traditional roles of wife and housekeeper for an education, a career, a political cause. Nearly everyone in Jewish Vilna was active in something. In a city of less than 60,000 Jews, there were close to 200 registered community groups, from chamber music ensembles and art societies to amateur theater guilds and sports clubs.
I don't remember
What
as
a
a teenager, not affiliated with some kind of club or movement. There was no such thing as free time, hanging around. What do you mean hanging around? We never hung around. There was always some kind of get-togethers. We were teenagers, and we loved American movies. But we knew America from Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And we knew it from Chaplin, of course.
So,
Vilna's institution of music, theater, and fine art provided a training ground for legendary talents, among them the renowned violinist Yasha Heifetz.
the Jewish community in Poland was extremely, like, I cannot overstate just how big, just how diverse, just and creatively diverse the community was. You had politicians of all stripes, of all affiliations, from the left to the right. You had movie makers. You had playwrights. You had poets, musicians. You had journalists. You had everything. It was a rich and vibrant community, correct? Yes. Both of these words fit perfectly to describe Poland before 1939, which had 3.5 million Jewish people in it.
Expressionist painter Chaim Soutine. The city attracted celebrated performers and artists from all over Europe. In 1935, Marc Chagall, visiting Vilna, was inspired to paint scenes of the city. Homegrown talents like the Yiddish Theater Company, the Vilna Truppe, played to packed houses throughout Europe and
Jewish
America,
theaters.
performing not only Yiddish works, but also Chekhov, Shakespeare, Molière, and O'Neill. Yiddish also permeated the literature that came out of Vilna in those years. An avant-garde literary group was formed, Jung Vilna, which used Yiddish as its chosen language. First published by the city's leading Yiddish daily in 1929,
Exactly.
the Jung Vilna
Yiddish
writers were an overnight
is the leading
sensation.
language.
Before long, they were publishing their own journal and holding public readings of their work.
The Jung Vilna evenings
Highlander.
really became community events. They would be held in a big auditorium, and the audience would be packed with anticipation. You never knew what was going to happen at the Jung Vilna evening because all of these writers were really quite eccentric, each in their own way. Jung Vilna was really a constellation of writers. They differed in terms of their genre, in terms of their influences, in terms of their subjects. What united them, though, was all of them were from Vilna, and all of them had a commitment to Yiddish as their literary language and as their medium.
Let that sink in. A commitment to Yiddish as the literary language. A strong commitment to Yiddish. Like, I know I'm repeating myself at this point, but Yiddish has been put on a list of languages that are endangered with extinction.
A new generation was now heralding a golden age. Jews at last became a part of society at large, while not sacrificing their identity.
Nowhere else could there be this culturally cohesive Yiddish-speaking environment. Not in New York, not in Warsaw, not in Montreal.
That's also not true about Warsaw. Warsaw had an extremely huge Yiddish community with press, Yiddish theaters, cinemas, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to have to disagree here. Respectfully.
Vilna really had all the institutions in place. A Yiddish school system, Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish
Warsaw had all these things. School system. Warsaw had it. Theaters. Warsaw had them. Cinemas. Warsaw had them. Hospitals. Warsaw had them. So if I have one criticism of the documentary is that it sort of tries to play up Vilna at the expense of other cities, which I'm not a big fan of. Gotta live in the same traditionally prim and proper homes, wear proper clothes, talk the same, walk the same, eat the same, believe the same. Right.
theater, Yiddish artists, Yiddish writers, Yiddish street signs. Everything was overflowing with Yiddish, and Vilna was the kernel for a dream of an autonomous Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe.
If you were from Vilna...
Like, once again, to put it into perspective, the Vilna Jewish community was 50,000 people. Warsaw had 350,000 people who spoke Yiddish and created in Yiddish. After all, the great Nobel Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer was from Warsaw.
You had to be very proud. People were very alive. There was an incredible vitality. There was a whole worldly generation in Vilna of Jews that were the first who became really free.
Freedom. And then... That's right.
But that exhilaration was tragically short-lived. By the early 1930s, the long shadow of fascism, already triumphant in Germany, had begun to creep across Vilna. Jews became the primary target of a belligerent nationalistic campaign to expel all minorities.
I went to state high school. I didn't feel any anti-Semitism in the beginning. They were very friendly. But everything changed in a few years with an outbreak of the most violent, most malicious anti-Semitism. The Polish university students were in forefront of anti-Semitic action. They were organizing demonstrations. They published anti-Semitic literature. I remember going through real crisis, real sort of depression, that the old world ceased to exist.
I had a friend who was a university student, and he came one day with a bandaged head. What happened? There was a rule that the Jewish students had to sit on the left. He made a mistake, and he sat on the right, and he was beaten up. And we thought, oh, God, no.
In 1935, as German Jews were being stripped of their civil rights, Polish President Józef Pilsudski, the leader who had transformed life for Vilna's Jews, died.
Interestingly enough, Józef Piłsudski actually wanted to attack Nazi Germany preemptively. First Endetia and then the German cultural preference for order materialized into national socialism. Well, unfortunate. We'll probably dedicate streams to those topics. But for now, let's focus on this.
Almost immediately, right-wing nationalists forged a coalition with the new government and called for an official boycott against the Jews. Virtually overnight, the Nazi threat seemed more than a distant drumbeat.
Before the war, none of us believed that our world would come to a such terrible end. We were very young. We felt that the world is waiting for us. And we listened very carefully to Hitler's speeches. We still believed that logic and reason will prevail.
I would just like to intersect here by saying history repeats itself. History rhymes. Okay? There are people right now that believe that logic will prevail, that all you have to do is a civil debate with the fascists and that reason will be on top. Yes, we just do not learn. We don't learn.
In 1939, the last day of August, on a veranda of our rented little summer home is the first time when I danced with a girl. I recall that the record then on the record player was Stormy Weather. And as I started to dance, it was dawn and the bombs started to fall.
September 1, 1939, the Second World War had begun. Just days before, Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact and secretly agreed to divide Poland between them.
Of course, Marxists, Leninists, especially those who have a leaning towards Stalin, will argue that's not the case, but we know what happened.
Vilna went to the Russians, who had annexed Lithuania and proceeded to grant the Lithuanians full command of the city. The Jews in what was now Nazi-occupied Poland began streaming into Vilna by the thousands in search of a safe haven.
There were lots of people who came then to Vilna from Warsaw. There were refugees. In our house, every day was filled with some newcomers, and everyone was full of stories.
We had come out of Warsaw just before the ghetto. Before the ghetto was set up, we had escaped the bombing, we had escaped the firing squad. My mother and father and I were reunited after an extraordinary series of events. So Vilna was a normal world for just a brief moment. But things changed very, very quickly in, I think it was in June of 1940, when my parents and I had gone in to see Marie Antoinette with Norma Shearer and Tyrone Power. We went into the theater, and the Lithuanians were in power. We came out of the theater, and the Russian tanks were rolling down Vilna streets, and people were running and beginning to hoard in an absolute panic.
And then,
wresting back control of Vilna, the Russians inaugurated a vicious offensive against suspected threats to their regime, including many Jews.
Yeah.
Yet most of the Jewish population still believed that Soviet domination would at least keep them safe from the Nazis. On June 22, 1941, Hitler suddenly reneged on his non-aggression pact with Stalin and declared war on the Soviet Union. Within a few days, the Red Army was on the run, and German troops had occupied Vilna.
Beginning at the end.
The Germans went after the Jews right away. Within a couple of days, they issued orders that all Jews must wear a circle with a yellow J inside that circle for Jude.
When the Germans came in, people were taken off the street and disappeared. Men especially started to disappear, either taken from the street or from their apartments.
This is something that people don't understand. Just how many executions were happening in the eastern parts of pre-World War II Poland. Hundreds of thousands of people were executed. Just keep this in mind. There were certain records, but it is interesting that you ask this question, how do you know someone is a Jew if they don't wear the tag? Because there were certain Jewish families that actually did survive the Holocaust by pretending to be Germans. And it actually worked. I will release a video in the near future, which will be a story of a family of a person who pretended to be German, started a German company which was named by the Nazi regime as a crucial company to the war effort. And this person saved numerous Jewish people by hiring them in the company. So that's a whole story that I will sort of show in a video that will be released fairly soon.
We used to call it harpoons. People were kidnapped.
I was going to a barber shop to have a haircut when a German noticed me. They picked me up. They accumulated about 500 young men, able-bodied men. They took us to a place that became infamous later, which is called Ponari.
My aunt, Yetta, my mother's younger sister, had a dacha in Ponari. Yetta was one of the first persons that witnessed and that realized that the Germans have turned that area of Ponari into a place of execution.
We were taken off one by one from the truck and marched to the grave. I was quietly going towards the grave in this belief that I'm going to die. I just did not believe that this is the last moment of my life. Shortly before the grave, I fell. The shot went off at the very split second. The shooter believed that he hit me and I fell. I simply fell. The next victim fell on top of me. When I came home and told the story, in the apartment house where I lived, nobody believed me except my parents.
People, keep in mind, people, for a very long time, people just could not believe that things could be this bad. A lot of people were in denial about it. And there were people that survived like this through such coincidences that they fell and they were in the piles of executed bodies and they later run away. You know?
There was such a need for the people sort of indulge into sort of self-deception. The reality was so terrible that I think everybody was doing his best in order not to believe what was so evident.
It's not so easy to just learn German, by the way.
On the morning of September 6,
Easier said than done.
1941,
They
German
were
soldiers
certain
rounded up
records.
the city's Jews and herded them into a walled ghetto that they had created in Vilna's old
There
Jewish
were certain records on people as well, so keep that in mind as well.
quarter. Days before, the Nazis had executed the majority of the Jews that had lived there.
It was very scary because all this was empty. We were among the first to arrive. We went up to one of the houses to an apartment. The door was open. There was in the dining room a table where people did not finish their meal. They were taken away there. There was still food in the plates.
Vilna's Jewish quarter, home to a vibrant community for more than 400 years, had become little more than a holding pen.
Same with Warsaw, the Warsaw Ghetto.
In a neighborhood that only days before had held nearly 4,000 people, some 40,000 now crowded together, consumed by terror and dread.
Keep in mind, the Warsaw Ghetto held over 400,000 people crammed into a very small area. The ghettos were a place where people died of starvation by the hundreds of thousands.
Ich bronze im Ghetto von Gessel zu Gessel und kenn ihn gefinnen kein Ort.
There was no cannibalism. Not that I know of, but no.
Trockt men a Rieber, Menschen sagt hoch a Wort. Es läuft auf mein Heim jetzt der Himmel, der Bläue, was sich ob ich jetzt davon. Ich steh wie a Bettler bei jedem Teuer und bettel a bissel Sonn.
Unbeknownst to the ghetto population, every man, woman, and child was marked for execution. Over a period of months, the Nazis would carry out periodic so-called actions against the Jews, transporting them to their death at the killing fields of Ponari.
Right.
In spite of a fear that each time we go to bed, we'll be awakened by the Germans, never could be certain that the night will go by to the morning. In spite of that, in the morning, people would get up, go to work, and think of where they're going to get food, where they're going to get some news from our friends.
Yeah.
That's where survivorship became so evident.
I'm more educated on the Warsaw Ghetto, and part of the resistance against Nazi occupier was growing food at places like the cemetery even. And well, it was a struggle for survival, and still within the first year or so, about 100,000 people died of starvation in the Warsaw Ghetto. And what is important to note that at some point people started being taken to the death camps, and there's a very tragic element to it. In Warsaw, the chief of the Jewish community was asked to sign the first order for the first transport of people to the death camp, and he refused to do so and committed suicide. And since the starvation in the ghetto was so great, there were people that went to the Umschlagplatz from which they were taken to the death camps just to get the scraps of food that people were given. The Jewish community, the head of the Jewish community. So some people were so desperate for food that they went to the Umschlagplatz of their own will to just get anything to eat. And once they received their scraps, they were taken to the death camps.
The most striking thing about the Vilna ghetto compared to other ghettos is the variety and quantity of cultural activity. These were people who lived under constant conditions of humiliation and dehumanization. They needed some counterweight to this. The first concert in the ghetto took place on January 18th, 1942.
I have to stress this. These sort of events happened in Warsaw as well, concerts, etc. Because people had to try to live normal lives, even in the worst of circumstances.
At this first concert, there was one song introduced, which was a creation in the ghetto itself, and that is the song Yisrolik by the ghetto composer Leib Rosenthal, performed by his sister Chayla Rosenthal.
Israelit, bin das Kind von Ghetto. Hey, Israelit, a hefker dicker Jung. Coach verblieben, Kohle netto, der lang ist, heißt noch a Trische und a Gut. Coach verblieben, Kohle netto, der lang ist, heißt noch a Trische und a Gut.
Yisrolik was an
People
orphan,
did grow food.
one who has been deprived of everything by the terrible events that have taken place, nevertheless remains a cheerful and even a whistling young man, and advises the audience, why bring up the things that we have lost? It only makes things worse.
The ghetto residents harnessed their remaining resources, determined to maintain a functioning society with some semblance of normalcy. Doctors organized free clinics and milk stations. Schools were established. Among the beloved teachers was the incomparable Mira Bernstein.
Mira had tremendous dedication to children, making the days or months they were alive meaningful. She had a class from which children disappeared every day, every second day. Children were missing and not alive anymore. But Mira couldn't afford to be overwhelmed by the great tragedy and disaster, not to do what she was supposed to do as a teacher.
Right. And I might add, there's also another very famous figure, Janusz Korczak, who famously, a writer, who was a principal of a orphanage. And he was actually offered an out of the ghetto. He was offered to be smuggled out of the ghetto, and he refused the offer to be smuggled to safety, because he refused to leave the children in the ghetto alone. And famously, he went, when the children were taken to the Platz to be taken to the camps, he went with the children, holding them by their hands. Physical labor was done at the camps. I'll see you soon, fake Alec Parker.
It was the Vilna way. Spirituality, knowledge, culture. These were the touchstones, and these were the hedges against despair and defeat. Even in the ghetto, with the stench of death surrounding them, people remained resilient. In their darkest hours, lectures, plays, and concerts sustained them.
When the Nazis came to the...
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your questions. At the camps? You mean at the death camps? It was forced labor. It was like when people arrived at the camps, they were separated into two groups: people who could do forced labor, and people who were basically just sent to the gas chambers right away. And those people were doing manual labor to, well, I would have to look what sort of, what in particular. There was some manual labor to craft things for the Nazis.
The concerts.
It was not for them. It was forced labor, of course.
They couldn't get over what high a level under these circumstances that we were, that this was performed.
there was theater. Somehow, it seems to me unbelievable, but there was theater in the ghetto of Vilna. For a moment, there was a miracle happening on the stage, lights would go on, and there was a different world, there was a different reality. It was a possibility of escape in the ghetto.
For actors and writers, it was some way of legitimizing their very presence in the ghetto. And it's characteristic of Vilna that they would even worry about this question. What are we going to do with our actors, our teachers, our literary people?
Yeah.
The Jewish Quarter's library became a sanctuary for the ghetto's residents. The demand was so great that the library stayed open 6 and sometimes 7 days a week.
It was a place of quiet, a place where you could rest from these terrible uncertainties and fears. You were in the world of books, which remained as if untouched by the event.
13-year-old Yitzchak Rudashevsky wrote in his diary, "The book unites us with the future. The book unites us with..."
Okay. So the prisoners were forced to do work beyond their physical capabilities. They carried from train carts to the magazine, to the storage units, big bags with cement, bricks, and big heavy items, and they were beaten and hurried up by the capo. So that should answer your question. Well, people died while performing the labor, of course.
The world. "100,000 books were circulated the first year of the ghetto. If they could preserve their books, they could preserve their culture, a way to defy Hitler's stampeding death machine. All across Europe, the Nazis were dismantling Jewish libraries and sending the most valuable materials to Frankfurt, to their...
Which, I will remind you, the books were in Yiddish, the language that is on the brink.
So-called Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. The Germans had already raided major Judaica collections in Germany and France, but Vilna's vast collection overwhelmed them. A group of ghetto intellectuals were ordered to sort through the materials. 2 members of Young Vilna were among them, the acclaimed Yiddish poets Abraham Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginsky. But these poets had a plan of their own.
Sending these materials to Frankfurt was almost the equivalent as sending them to destruction. So they decided they must hide the materials. And that involved, at the end of the workday, stuffing it inside their shirts, their pants, their boots, and then trying to smuggle them back into the ghetto. The only safe place they felt was among Jews. The ghetto police were much more concerned about finding people smuggling food into the ghetto, and in fact mocked them and gave them the nickname the Papier Brigade, the Paper Brigade. Many inhabitants of the ghetto thought that they were crazy, but these people were very committed. This isn't just pieces of paper. This is the stuff of Jewish history.
I can already answer. They wanted the slaves to starve and crumble. They were called death camps for reasons, as opposed to labor camps.
And of Jewish life.
culture and resistance converged in the paper brigade. Not only did Sutzkever and Kaczerginski and most of the others become partisans, but they utilized their ability to go back and forth into the ghetto to smuggle not just books, but also weapons and ammunition.
Sog nit keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, hot Himmeln bleine verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgewenkte Show, es wird apoikt on unser Trott mir seinen Do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgewenkte Show, es wird apoikt on unser Trott mir seinen Do.
By the beginning of 1942, a group of political activists in the Vilna ghetto had formed a unified resistance movement, the first in any ghetto in Eastern Europe. It was known as the UPO, the United Partisans Organization, and one of its commanders was a poet named Abba Kovner.
The call for Jewish armed resistance was on the 1st of January 1942 at the meeting of the Zionist Chalutzim groups, and then was called the famous Abba Kovner's proclamation, "Let's not go like sheep to slaughter."
The UPO published an underground bulletin and masterminded acts of sabotage.
In one of the first military actions, 3 members of the Jewish underground left the ghetto nighttime, put a mine, and derailed a German military train.
Keep in mind, and I said this when I did my summary of the conference about the wasted lessons of the genocide, and you have to remember the building of the death camps, the tracks that took Jewish people to the death camps, the trains that were dedicated to taking Jewish people there, the gas that was used, the whole infrastructure. Those were real resources that were redirected from the war effort and dedicated to the genocide. So the whole thing was irrational, of course, from its very foundations.
Which went to the front line. The Germans, of course, didn't relate this mining activity to Jewish underground, otherwise they would retaliate against the Jews in the ghetto very severely.
The partisans even broke into Vilna's centuries-old Jewish Rome press, shrewdly making off with thousands of printer fonts, precious pieces of lead, which they melted down for bullets.
Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Liedl von a Vogel läuft er frei. Das hat a Volk zwischen fallen dicke Wend. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Händ. Das hat a Volk zwischen fallen dicke Wend. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Händ.
But in the end, Vilna's partisans and poets, its authors and actors, its teachers, its doctors, its children, were doomed.
Es hat uns das Leben gerufen, das Leben von sonnige Tag, hat jeder in Lande sein munter gespannt, was untergegangen sein Weg. Zu 1, 2, 3, zu 1, 2, 3, auf Arbeit im Weg sich gelost. Jeder Trott hat sein Klang, jeder Weg ist sein Gesang, wenn du gehst und du weißt, wo verwas.
On September 23rd, 1943, the final liquidation of the Vilna ghetto began. Those who remained were either murdered at Ponari or else sent to their death in concentration camps in Estonia and Latvia. By the end of the war, nearly 70,000 had perished.
And keep in mind, when sent to the death camps, the small children were the first, along with the old people, to be killed.
I came to Vilna in 45 after the war. And I came to a cemetery. I did not want to live in a cemetery.
The old Vilna, my Vilna, the Vilna of my parents, my people, didn't exist. It was eradicated, it was destroyed, it was annihilated. I lost something which would never be replaced. And then I said, what did I gain? Is it possible that in spite of this tremendous loss, I gained something? And it was very difficult for me to define, but I felt that I have my people, whether they know it or not. I have my culture. I have a certain set of concepts about life, and they are with me.
I do think that Vilna will remain an anchor in Jewish history. Through much of the second millennium, Vilna was the center of the Jewish world. This is not going to be forgotten. Jews in America, in Israel, in South Africa, all over the world will continue to look to Vilna as a place that gave them a sense of themselves. It's now a Vilna of the mind, of the memory, of our own history.
Unser Heimat, unser Bänkschaft und Bagger. Ach, wie oft es ruft dein Namen von mein Heuger ist Wilner Gesslach, Wilner Tein, Wilner Wälder Berg und Ton. Es Neue, es bringt sich noch die Zeiten von Amor.
And that's it. That's the documentary.
Den Wälderle Sekreter in sein Schatten eingehüllt.
So what I'm hoping is that this documentary, alongside the City of Bones segment that will premiere in a few days, that it will paint a broader picture of the history of the community and of what was lost. Culture and people destroying.
Wie oft es ruft dein Namen von mein Augen Vilner Gesslach, Vilner Teichen, Vilner Wälder Berg und Hof. Es Neue, es bringt sich noch die Zeiten von Amor. Es Neue, es bringt sich noch die Zeiten von Amor.
Oh. So yes, that's the segment.